Sports have been around for thousands of years. These early sports were nothing more than sprinting and wrestling. Throughout time, sports evolved. Hockey, lacrosse, baseball, basketball, football, and soccer were created. Many people today can't live without watching their favorite sports team. But in 1939, the sporting world was knocked flat on its back as World War II began. This is how World War II affected the sporting community, as well as how sports were integrated into the war. As the war started to take shape, there was an angry and violent mood lurking above everyone. Unfortunately, this mood landed on the sporting community and specifically the National Hockey League. In the NHL season before the war started, the top 10 penalty leaders totaled 573 penalty minutes. But as the tension and violence started to grow in the war, it too transferred into the NHL. The war started in 1939, and this NHL season saw a rise on trips to the penalty box. The top 10 penalty leaders this time recorded 627 penalty minutes. When it got to the middle of the war, the top 10 penalty leaders recorded an alarming amount of 783 penalty minutes. As the war dragged on, it appears that everyone was done with the violence, and by the end of the war, the top 10 penalty leaders only totaled 531 minutes, and the season after the war totaled just 513 minutes. Obviously, World War II affected people's play, and that doesn't mean just hockey, but it would have affected all other sports the same way. Throughout the war, many people lost their lives. This loss of life devastated the Interprovincial Football Union and Interprovincial Rugby Football Union. Since there is such a high loss of life out of these two leagues, Canada had to suspend play during the war. Sports weren't all just affected because of the loss of life, but because most of the sporting equipment material went straight to the war. These materials most commonly being rubber and wood. Despite baseball using both of these materials, the sport was still able to continue on during the war because of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He created the Green Light Letter, which stated that baseball must keep playing since there were so many fans and players. Just like baseball, basketball was also unaffected by the war since most players were too tall to be eligible for the war. Luckily for the NHL, even though over 100 players went to fight, only 2 lost their lives. Even though professional athletes were put into the war, they made the best of it. Joe Louis, some may call him the best boxer of all time. He held the heavyweight title for 11 years and had a record of 66 wins, 3 losses. He joined just after the attack on Pearl Harbor and played a key role in recruiting black people into the war. Despite the fact that black people were helping the United States fight, this did not stop the discrimination against them. In 1941, Harvard University was scheduled to play against the United States Navy in field lacrosse, but they refused to play Harvard because of a black player on the team. Once the black player left, the game was a go. Harvard lost 12-0. This loss was most likely caused by Harvard refusing to play since their teammate was kicked out for his skin color. Louis Zamperini was another famous athlete who was involved a lot during the war. He was an Olympic distance runner and served as a bombardier in the war. After his plane went down in the ocean, killing 8 of 11 crew, he was forced to survive adrift at sea. He was eventually captured by the Japanese Navy and sent to a prisoner of war camp where he was beaten. Thankfully, he survived. Although these prisoner of war camps were often brutal, sports did find their way in. Prisoners usually gathered balls to play spirited games of soccer and rugby, and often even their captors would join into the fun. This shows that even throughout all this violence, people were still brought together with sport. Every 2 years, the Paralympics are held, either for summer or winter. But most people don't know how it all started. The Paralympics were created in 1948. This Special Olympics was for the returning World War II athletes who had spinal injuries. Now the Paralympics has grown to be a huge event for anyone with special abilities. It is indisputable the war affected sports in many ways, both positively and negatively. Even with only the minimum, sports endured the war years. It was shown that violence initially increased in sports, but later it declined to normal towards the end of the war because everyone was sick of the fighting. Sports also helped people cope and persevere through the hardships of war, shown by what happened in prisoner of war camps when everyone got together to have some fun. In difficult times, sports has a way of helping people temporarily escape the harsh realities they face. It can have a therapeutic effect. Growing up in Canada, I was given the choice between two sports, lacrosse and hockey. I chose lacrosse. Ever since then, I've been involved in lacrosse, either as a coach or a player. When I found out that I had a choice on what I wanted to research in World War II, I knew right away I was going to look into sports. I know sports are violent enough, but I always wondered if the violence could increase due to a war environment. This 1940s era was also home to many great athletes, so I was curious to see if their lives were interfered with by the war. I think sports are a very important part of Canadian culture, and for myself being highly involved in sports, I was intrigued to see whether the sporting world we currently have in Canada was ever changed due to World War II. I learned a lot during this project, and now when I go out to fight other teams, I remember that some athletes actually did go out and fight, not just for a team, but for their country in war.